So I am joined today by Sean Withford. Thank you for joining us, Sean.
Thanks for having me, Emma.
So the overarching topic of today, which I have to say I'm super fascinated about, is neuromarketing. Very excited to learn more. Before we jump into what I suspect is quite a meaty topic there, do you want to give us a bit of an introduction to you, what you do currently, and maybe give us a walk through your career history as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start at the beginning. So I started out my career with a big McCann Erickson, so big brand ad agency, working on brands like Microsoft, MasterCard, Coca-Cola. I used to make the old Paddle Pop line TV commercials back in the day, but this is going back 24 years ago. So marketing was very different back then. It was a lot of TV, and it was where we used to talk about above the line, below the line, a lot of TV, a lot of print, and those sorts of things. I think at the time, it was a smartphone if you had Snake back then. And so I worked in marketing for years. I actually interviewed for a client-side marketing role with a recruitment agency. And then when I got to that interview, they convinced me I'd make a wonderful recruiter. So ended up then being in the recruitment industry for about 7 years. And then was one of the early employees at LinkedIn. And they, I guess, liked that sort of Venn diagram of marketing experience and talent industry experience, because that's a lot of what they were looking for at the time.
Absolutely.
And then had an amazing ride there. So I was one of the very first employees, and left around the time like the Microsoft acquisition, so over about 6 years, and got to see that like massive growth trajectory and learned a lot.
That would have been super interesting, I'm sure.
It was the best. Like, it was just fascinating, and I have so many good memories and good friends and good connections from that time. But also it wasn't mine, right? Like, if anyone listening is an entrepreneur, that's always the I think it comes to big driver, as that the opportunity to own and build and choose. So that was a big part. And when I was there, so actually we could see it. So we had a lot of different companies that were investing in amplification tools on LinkedIn. Hopefully I'm saying this. Well, there was this challenge that a lot of companies would essentially buy space to run marketing and talent brand marketing on LinkedIn, but then not have used it 12 months on. They'd have these credits going and they're, well, we didn't have our content strategy in place. We didn't, they knew that they wanted to do it, but they didn't have the right things in place to do it effectively. And so that was really the genesis of Eloquent. And then I'll talk about how Eloquent sort of gets into neuromarketing. So the beginning of Eloquent, which is the business I own now, along with my business partner, Rich, we started out doing a lot of marketing for businesses in the talent space, but over that time we evolved and we became more a B2B marketer. But then as part of that journey, so you start looking at what makes a campaign successful and what doesn't. And it would always come back to, does the core message resonate with your audience? And we would find that, you would learn new tactics and new ways of nurturing and new paid strategies and new nurturing strategies. And, here's a clever way of titling this email or that mail or this offer or that offer. But at the core, if people cared about the message and they cared about the brand and they cared about the offer, campaigns worked. And if they didn't, there was no amount of marketing optimization on the other side that would save that. Yeah. So a good offer that people care about or are interested in will always perform. And so we were trying to zero in on that. How do we find things that reliably and predictably perform well? And so we then started moving into what we call behavioural marketing. So behavioural marketing is looking at research around why people make decisions and looking at a lot of the theories of influence and psychology. And so we started then weaving that into the marketing of what we're doing. And then it was actually someone found us, a lady called Enemy, and she was an expert neuromarketer and had run neuromarketing businesses. And she was like, hey, I can actually make this even better, because behavioral psychology is looking at studies and what you can observe. Neuromarketing then takes it that one step further, right? So neuromarketing literally lets you look at, let's call them biometric markers, and there's different ones with different levels of sophistication that we can talk about. But you can actually measure the emotional response to your marketing, which is amazing, right? So you can see boredom or interest or desire or frustration. You can see those emotions happen with almost anything. But so branding, positioning, websites, user testing for your apps, like working out if an advert's going to be compelling in a news feed, if it's going to capture attention. You can test all of that stuff. We've tested, I think there's a big missed opportunity. You can test sales decks and online sales presentations, right? This is when they were confused with, this is when they were bored. This is when they were interested, right? So you can surface a lot of that data, which is amazing. So, and then now there's Eloquent, which is a marketing agency that uses behavioral marketing, that uses neuromarketing to make what we do better. And we've still got that roots where we do a lot of employment brand and recruitment related sort of marketing as well over there. And then we have the Neuromarketing Labs, which is, it's actually for businesses that might want to do the testing and the insights work, but without the creation of the work, right? Like they want to test their campaigns for advice, but they want to do it themselves. So, and also a lot of other agencies as well. So we're finding that for that Neuromarketing Labs offering, and it's very it's important we keep those things kind of separate because there'll be some confidentiality about what they want to test as well. So that's sort of where we're at today. So the desire to work out what would make a campaign land and emotionally connect took us through behavioral marketing into neuromarketing. And we do, Eloquent as an agency is doing a lot of that. And then the Neuro Labs as a standalone testing suite, let's call it as well.
So interesting. And I guess it's that idea of you saying, like, with behavioral, perhaps previously you would learn from it and obviously kind of tweak and adjust as you go on, but with the neuromarketing it's getting ahead of it before it's even happened, so you don't have to kind of learn as you go. You've already found out before you've launched whatever the piece of collateral might be.
And I think that while there's some marketing that you can test digital iterations quickly, right? So I can create 10 different versions of an ad and see which one's going to work, but I've got to spend time and money on it. But there's a lot of really good case studies and examples of brands where, if you think about packaging, right, it's too late, right? Like once you print 5 million labels on a can of something, put it in the supermarket and then find out if it connects with people, it's too late. And the other big thing that we find as well is that it sort of replaces market research. So a lot of companies weren't necessarily looking at neuromarketing, but they absolutely want to do audience insights and testing and market research. The problem with market research is, I can talk a lot about this, but what people say they will do and what they do rarely aligns. And so you'd see this a lot. They used to do research for green products, right? So everyone will say, oh yes, I will buy that thing that's good for the environment. But then when they're in the supermarket shelf and it costs 48 cents more, they don't. So often as well, that comes up if you think about the dynamics of people do like group focus testing, and then there's group dynamics. And now the most extroverted outspoken person in the room says something, everyone agrees. People don't want to disagree with the group, so they don't give honest feedback as well. So that's another big challenge with traditional market research. So, and then the third, and this is really hard to solve, is when you do traditional market research, people might actually be able to tell you, they can differentiate, I prefer this, I don't prefer this, but we can't measure it and aggregate it, right? So knowing that someone does, like, there's two executions and they like both, but
Yeah.
it's not until you know that they like one 76 out of 100 and one 82 out of 100, and they can't elicit that. We don't know really.
Yeah.
Well, maybe people are more in touch with their emotions than I am. But right, like, but Neuro helps surface that. All of a sudden, you can see it. They like both, but this one wins by X percentage points. And then you can see that correlate in the performance of the execution as well.
Super interesting.
Yeah.
How, as you said before, I'm sure there's kind of many facets of it and many different ways in which you can approach it. Can you give us some examples, I guess, of how you would use it and the types of approaches?
Yeah, definitely. It's probably good. I'll tell you about the bits of tech that you can use of them, because with that understanding of the bits of tech, then you use the different ones for different things. So the gold standard in Neuro is essentially a headset that it doesn't look too dissimilar to a pair of headphones, right? So it's not too crazy.
Not the old Back to the Future where it's got the big thing
yeah,
on.
it's fine. It doesn't have sci-fi lights lighting up. But it's basically a fMRI. It's measuring your brain, and it can actually see light ups in activity, and different light ups in activity correlate to different areas and different emotions. So you can measure and see those emotions. That's the gold standard in measurement, but it's also the most expensive to do, because you've got to bring someone in, you've got to put them in a lab environment, you've got to put the headset on them, you need someone qualified to do that process with them. It takes a lot more time, right? You need key representatives. So, but also it's the one with the most insight. So just, it depends on your audience and how specialized they are and the value of the concept that you're testing. That's the right approach. Then what you've got is facial recognition and eye tracking software. And think of this as almost a little bit more like a lie detector, yeah? Or an FBI facial recognition expert. So it can look at, like, much the same as those like FBI profilers, right? They might not be able to see brainwaves happen, but they can see, you know, a brow furrow and an eye tick and a smirk and a smile. And so eye tracking combined with facial recognition can pick up all of those different micro expressions that humans are actually, we're not great at picking up. Some of them we can. But that technology, if you think about it, it's a lot more affordable, right? Because you can test things, you know, you can do it to an extent over Zoom. You don't need the headsets. It's invasive. You can do it for more people. So there's different ways that you can test things there as well. And then you've also got another category that we would call, and I think people will probably trust this tech now more as AI is becoming a lot more popular. There's also predictive neuromarketing technology. And so say that you get someone with a headset to look at 10,000 websites, and it all goes into a big data algorithm, right? So here's what people notice, here's what they don't, here's what they look at, here's what they don't, here's what they're blind to, here's how they read, here's how we're attracted to colors and shapes and patterns. You can feed that into a predictive algorithm and then test things. And now that is then a lot faster, a lot more cost effective, but it's generalized. So it talks about how a population might respond to something as distinct to how a CEO or a CFO might respond to something. So if you want to test different things. And the other thing that that's better for is design. So really good at helping show levels of attention that it might grab and clarity of your message on a you know, for a social post or a Google ad or those sorts of things. So there's different tech, and you use it for testing different things. So that sort of predictive AI, really good for low cost, fast, rapid testing of stuff like ad campaigns and imagery for websites and those sorts of things. So you can do smart things really quickly with a high level of certainty. And also you can, we've worked with companies where we'll almost create templates based around those principles. So you can build a suite of templates for all of your Google ads, so that next time you've got to go one, it's neuro optimized for your brand and your colors, and the words are there and the pictures there and the images there, and that's the thing most likely to capture attention. And we can see, we test this stuff with ourselves, right? Like something with a high score will, you know, by significant factors outperform the other stuff. And sometimes we might have had opinions on it, right? Like, oh, I think this execution's better that, but sometimes we're right, sometimes you're not, right? You have
I was
opinions,
going to
but
ask
then
that, like whether you're ever like really surprised by what you see. Obviously, you know, 20 odd years as a marketer, you've built up a bank of your own knowledge and experience, and you would have your own feelings, assumptions, thoughts as to what you think would work. Have you ever been like totally surprised by
yeah,
never would have seen that one coming?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You think you know, but it's
Yeah.
there's opinions and then there's data,
Yeah.
and I think, you know, it's like all of us have our own experiences and learnings, and
And bias as well, I guess, of like, yeah.
we've all got our biases and our blind spots, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think that's a big part of it. But yeah, so it surfaces that really well as well. So
Yeah.
AI is great for that stuff. Facial coding and recognition is then really good for more advanced stuff, I would say, where you want to see micro expressions, and really good for stuff like UX testing, right? So we
Yeah.
can give someone a website and say, oh, like, you know, apply for a credit card, right? And you can see the like brow furrow when the button wasn't at the place that they thought it was going to be. And then when the pop-up comes and it asks for another form after they thought they'd already filled in the form, you can see the anger. Right? And in fact, if you just
We've all
watch
been there.
yeah. You can see it in the recording. You can see the spikes. You can see where the emotion is. You can see it on their face. And with the eye tracking, you can see where they were looking when they experienced that thing. So it's really great for that as well. And then with the headsets and the fMRI, that's a lot better for positioning, messaging, those sorts of concepts, because it's not an information that's being processed as so much visually as it is in your brain, right? Like if I read 5 options for a tagline for a business, for example, or where I'm processing that as sort of a lot more here rather than on my face. So that's great for that. So that's the different use cases. Almost anything that you want to test, you can test. In fact, Anime, who's the neuromarketer and the GM of Neurolabs and Eloquent, she talked about how in South Africa, a company actually developed neuro wine, right? So, and because if you think about it, it's measuring an emotional response to a stimulus. So we're using it for marketing, but right, like you could give people some wine and see which one lights up the pleasure centers, make more of that. So you could literally find the thing that's the most delicious and lights up pleasure centers in a group of people and make it on that basis. I think that's like a really interesting, different understanding.
Yeah. In the one that you called the gold standard, the headset one, how many or what sort of sample size, like what sort of number of people would you ideally want to get through that process to get a solid result?
It's a great question. There's no one answer. For a clinical, and we should have neuroscientists answering this, for a clinical study, I think it's usually around 20 that you need it for it to be clinical. Having said that, if you've got
a huge number, actually, is it?
It's not.
No.
And you can get some really strong directional information out of 6 to 8 people. The problem is if you have 8 people and everyone was really consistent in what they did, then and 8 was probably enough. But if you do 8 and 4 are wildly different from the other 4, then you're going to need a bigger sample size. The other variable as well is how defined or broad the audience that you're trying to test is.
Yeah.
So if it's general population, sometimes you might need more because you need different genders, ethnicities, all these sorts of different things.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's going in on a tighter audience, just using CFOs as an example because someone's trying to promote an accounting software, you can actually narrow down a little bit more, but not as many as you would think. Certainly not as many, but that's the variable on how much it's going to cost you as well, though, right? Because it's you can build out pricing on a per head basis. We need 12 heads, we need 20 heads, but we sort of design a study for it essentially.
Super interesting. And as you say, my initial instinct would be that a sample size would be even hundreds, would be like a big group, but as you say, 20 to be clinical, yeah, it surprises me. It's actually not that many
Yeah,
people.
yeah,
Yeah. And I
yeah,
guess again that helps with a cost perspective, doesn't it? If you're not needing to get hundreds of, and also where do you get these hundreds of people? I guess time,
yeah,
cost,
yeah.
everything. Yeah.
Definitely, definitely, and that's where that's where a lot of the time and money is, and the time's
Mm.
not cheap either, right? So you got to spend a fair bit
No, no.
building the laboratory, as you call it.
Yeah. I'm really interested and appreciate if you can't get into the super specifics of examples of your clients as confidentiality, etc. But are
Sure.
you able to give some kind of like broad examples of what you've done, what you've learned, that even the types of brands and the way in which it has been used?
Yeah, definitely. So we've worked with some big FMCG brands on a global basis. And they were testing a new TVC for that was going across like multiple countries.
Mm.
Um, and so for that, it was working out if the message of the TVC landed, right? And
Yeah.
actually, it wasn't. And you could see these big gaps, and they didn't know why. And it was really obvious as soon as you used Neuro because the message that they wanted to convey just wasn't clear at all. And
Mm.
so the commercial that people told them was good in testing that wasn't working in the real world was confusing.
Oh, so they
Um,
had already tested it in some way from
yeah,
a research perspective, and that
yeah,
research said it was landing, but it
yeah,
actually
yeah,
wasn't. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So focus groups say yes, but then market said no, and then Neuro shows why. Yeah.
Cool.
But yeah, so we've done that. We've done work with a lot of B2B organizations where they're looking at positioning statements. So is it this or is it that? What's our promise? We've validated a lot of content marketing strategies, right? So which of these are you most likely to download? But before you go and spend a large amount of money on developing a white paper, you can see like
Mm.
where the emotional attention goes. We do a lot of website testing, so you can test websites and see like, oh, like these things that you want to matter are blind, right? Like people don't even see all of the stuff over here because of design and font size and colors,
Mm.
different visual elements on the page. Sorry, it's like a little flicker around Zoom. But you've got things like that. We've done, we're testing some like sales presentations at the moment. Again, really interesting to measure that. And sometimes it's testing, right? So working out what can and can't be tested. So like, you know,
Yeah.
can we test a webinar recording, right? If companies got on-demand webinar recordings, how do we like test for those as well? But yeah, a whole range of stuff.
Mm.
And yeah, a lot of Google ads, LinkedIn ads, Facebook ads
Yeah.
on what's going the most likely to perform, and designing templates and brands then around those brand guidelines too. What a brand
Yeah.
guideline works. So all of that stuff, all that stuff.
Are there any, I guess, broad rules with things, or not rules, or broad outcomes where, I don't know, when it comes to messaging, simple is always best, or when it comes to use of color, there's certain colors that people always gravitate to, or is it so nuanced that it literally changes? Are there certain things
Yeah,
that you could almost kind of take as a bit of a given?
there are some things design wise and concept wise that tend to be true,
Mm.
but it's always of the context of what else is on the page. Yeah,
Right.
so because as marketers we like it's like, oh, like I remember as a marketer, like just make the button like green or orange, right? Those shades, because everyone's tested them and those are the two that work. And it's like, well, it depends what else is on the page, right?
Mm.
It depends what your fonts are, what the sizes are, what the imagery is, what your font is. So like there's all of these things that, and again, as marketers, right, like, oh, you should do one of those because that's what worked. And it
Mm.
did for that test for that company, but that wasn't the only variable on the page. I won't name the company, but we did some like design work for someone recently where it was like, here's the perfect template to promote your brand. And they're like, oh, great. Like, we're just going to move this here and just like that. And it's, you know, the score goes from like 70 to 20 because yeah, I had to like, it's like, no, don't mess with it. Because there's things that we're used to be seeing in these campaigns, but then the reality is that that's not what performs. But yeah, like people are always attracted to faces in creative, but that can be good or bad, right? Because maybe you don't want them, like maybe the face is a distraction and they focus on the face rather than the message. So, but like round objects always tend to get more focus and attention than square objects. But again, right, like in the context of a design, that could be good or bad, right? Because it can grab attention on a page or it can distract the eye from the message. So yeah, it's really hard to say here's a set of rules from neuromarketing. There are a whole bunch of rules or heuristics from behavioral marketing that which is the other, you know, we were doing behavioral marketing, and what we tend to do is we will use behavioral marketing to come up with the concepts that we then test with neuro. Behavioral marketing, though, it's a lot of stuff that marketers these days would be familiar with. Some of those heuristics like social proof and trust and anchoring and priming, like that's behavioral marketing. And so, yeah, I would say that the heuristics of behavioral marketing actually do a better job of telling you where to create your marketing, or what elements to begin with and put in there. Neuromarketing helps you test whether it worked and whether you've done it properly, and which execution of those that you should use. So yeah, there's still a lot of that behavioral marketing tends to drive the rules, and then neuro measures the outcomes. I hope I've explained that okay.
No, it makes perfect it makes perfect sense. I'm interested in that example where the client started moving things around again.
I don't want them to feel attacked in case they listen, but
and it went down.
I didn't name anyone.
No. To be fair, it sounds exactly the kind of thing I would do. I'd be like, oh, I'll just tweak this, you know.
We all want to, yeah.
Objectively, would you look at it and think, did visually it look better one way or the other in terms of what we're used to seeing as creative, or again, is it much more nuanced than that?
It can be. But then it's your audience will be a lot of marketers that are used to working with CEOs, right? Like there's opinions on what works, and so often it's like, oh, I think it should be this, and it's like, well, you know, in my last business we did this, and so I've got to do the same thing because that's what it worked. But it's the context of what's there.
I suppose it's a great example actually, because as a marketer, it gets you away from those types of conversations. You know, if you've got we work with a lot of SME clients, and certainly with kind of heads of marketing, it's a conversation that we have all the time of perhaps the owner of the business who isn't as across marketing, or perhaps doesn't necessarily understand the value of marketing, or thinks they have a really good sense of what works, and there's always that dynamic at play of the marketer trying to kind of steer in a slightly different direction, and that doesn't always go so well. And if the data's there with something like this, there's actually not a conversation to be had, because it's there in black and white.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, like I talked about market research and interviews not being perfect. We still do a lot of that. So we do, but you then validate it with the testing, right? So typically when we're sort of suggesting a content plan or positioning or whatever it might be, there should be multiple data points, right? And it's like when we researched with people, here's what they said and what came out, and if we're using neuro at that phase, here's what the insights were. Then understanding behavioral marketing, here's a couple of principles that should make that message resonate and land, or be more interesting or compelling or engaging. And then it's based on that. Now we've made these couple of things. And then when we neuro test it, here's the one that stands at the top of that as the most likely to perform. And so once you've got all of those pieces in place, and then you can lay, I think as well, maybe internally inside of your business, it helps, gives a sense of confidence that there was some science and process behind the thing that you're saying.
Yeah, and I think as if you can always kind of come back to that data point, and it wasn't just someone's gut instinct of this piece of creative was better than the other, or and particularly, you know, if you're going to put significant money behind a particular campaign, or a TV advert, or, you know, whatever it might be, to have that confidence that actually this has been thoroughly tested and we're not just kind of seeing what'll happen. We have a pretty good instinct of what will happen because we've been through that process.
Absolutely.
I was going to ask a question that's probably very difficult to answer because there would be so many kind of different bits of context to it. But if someone's listening to this and thinking, oh, this sounds great, like how would our company get involved? Is there sort of a particular number in terms of investment that they'd need to be comfortable with to actually get value from it?
No, I don't have a number. But what I would say, just because, so the variable is what we're testing, right? So testing an hour-long webinar versus a single execution on a page is very different. And then testing general population versus 20 CFOs, it's very different just in terms of getting the people. But what I would say though is they would tend to be surprised at how affordable it is. You know, it's under 10 grand generally to do a suite of testing with AI and some visual coding as well. And it does go up from that, like if you want 20 people doing headset testing, that might be more around 20, 25, again with the variables, but the significant variable bit there being, who are you testing and who finds them, and do they need to be from one geography or 10? Because we do global studies as well, right? Like there's variables in there. But yeah, I would say that it's what does surprise people is it tends to skew less than their average market research. It tends to be less than what they were going to spend on focus groups, which just does surprise people. So that's nice.
And I guess you've got that comfort as well of what you then go on to spend in the actual marketing campaign, whatever it is much more likely to succeed because you've done the groundwork, and it's not just, oh, let's, I don't know, throw 100 grand at this and see what happens.
Absolutely.
You're not seeing what happens, you know.
Well, there's peace of mind. There's peace of, like, you know, we tested 10 variants on positioning, and this one like repeatedly was the most interesting and engaging with our audience, like at a brain level. So you've got that level of confidence then when you go to market. I haven't asked a lot of clients if we can talk about them, but I'll talk about some other companies that publish their stuff. Like Apple and Google and Meta/Facebook all have they've got internal neuro labs. So they've been using this technology and a lot of other businesses inside of their businesses for a long time, to help them make better decisions, not just from marketing, but also in building their products, right? So how do I make products more engaging and delightful, right? And unannoying, less annoying, unannoying, whatever. But you can see it, right? You can make a product listen by testing the emotional responses to it. So they've been using that stuff for a long time, but we have made it a lot more accessible for a much broader audience. If you're going to do market research, absolutely have a conversation, because it's a higher confidence interval and most likely lower cost. So that to me is one of the, if people are working out whether it's in their budget, that's what I'd suggest. If you're going to do market research, get in touch.
You mentioned webinars a couple of times. I'm quite interested to hear more about that. It is something particularly in that sort of B2B professional services space, which is one of those things that more and more companies are using for, you know, various reasons, whether it's lead gen or content or whatever it might be. What are you measuring? You said on an hour-long webinar, like, what are you measuring there?
Yeah.
How are you approaching that?
Well, it's literally what moment. So like, you know, we've got a neuromarketer enemy who's actually in the room here over there, who's been playing with how do you recreate the environment for someone, because it's tricky to have it presented live and then them sit there with a headset and it not to be a weird, unnatural circumstance for people, right? So the brainwaves will be unusual. So we've been testing, like, you know, with the projectors, if it's someone working on screen, do they watch, what's the sample size as well. When you can see the data that comes from the brain, there's almost different streams of emotions, and different peaks and troughs of emotions and combinations of emotions tell us different things. So we're literally working through now, like, well, how do you use it for that and test it? So I can't tell you the answer yet, but it's literally what we've been doing like this week.
Super interesting. And I guess,
because as far as I know, no one's doing that, right? Like no one's testing it.
And obviously, as you say, you don't know the answer yet because it hasn't you haven't finished it, but it might be things, I don't know, would it be around whether they're live or pre-recorded, the length, the level of engagement from the audience, how it's branded, how it looks, all of those things, I guess you're evaluating.
Yeah, absolutely. And for like a lot of businesses that, like, I think about, so coming from LinkedIn, right, which was a software sales background. And I think about 10,000 sales reps all running like 3 Zoom meetings a day selling stuff, and what the value is of improving that by 5% or 10% or 10%. Right, like, and so just being able to reverse engineer and actually, and this is why we're playing with it, right? Like, it's this untapped space that, like any of these big organizations that have so many people having these conversations, and I think post-COVID, so much of this, like pre-COVID, like, well, particularly in Australia, like Australia is a very face-to-face culture, right? I think America was a little less so just because geographically they're more dispersed. But certainly here, and I think in a lot of the UK, a lot of Asia, like pre-COVID, we met people still, and now like there is a lot less of face-to-face, and so we haven't really used the technology to work out how to make that experience better for both parties, right? Like, because actually, it's not. This is this interesting thing. I think when people hear neuromarketing, we imagine this sort of, you know, manipulation, or people like often think about, well, you know, neuromarketing, and they're like, oh, wasn't that thing where they like did subliminal messages of the buy Coca-Cola
like the old
NLP
days,
bought it in the movies? I'm like, no, that's not it. It's making stuff more interesting to people, based on seeing their interest, and it's making stuff less confusing to people based on seeing their confusion. So there's nothing manipulative about it. It's just making messages more like easier to understand and more palatable and more digestible, and communicating more clearly. And so I think it helps surface that. So look, if and when we crack it for sales teams, we'll definitely let you know.
Yeah, it's a huge, as you say, even, you know, particularly a business like a LinkedIn or any business of that scale, even a 1%, 2%, 3% uplift would be huge in terms of revenue numbers.
Totally.
Yeah, and you know, as you say, it might be
And
something
even down the
quite
line,
simple.
well, think about churn numbers as well. Like, churn's such a big problem. And if you can see that when you talk about certain features and certain things, if you can see confusion, it's like, oh, we need to do that better. We need to communicate this differently. We need to make it clearer. Maybe we need to show, not tell. Like, I actually think that, like, it's not just in sales, like there'll be like significant improvements in churn rates and all of those sorts of things, because you can see what people were confused about that didn't say that they were confused about as well. Through to onboarding, for that matter as well.
Yeah, it's a really good point. going back to something you said earlier, because I'm interested, you said when you were wanting to kind of leave and start your own business, and obviously had reasons for wanting to do that. How has it been? What are your reflections on having been through the process of starting your own business and now running it?
Yeah, look, it's like there's definitely peaks and troughs. I think before starting my own thing, I listened to a lot of I think they refer to it as entreporn, right?
Yeah.
So all of the podcasts from all of the, it's like, oh, you're gonna do this stuff and then just sit on the beach, and it's like, that hasn't been my experience. I think when you start your own thing, you're free to work. Like it was like, oh, I'm going to have this freedom of time. It's like, yeah, you're free to work at 1 o'clock. You're free to work at 2 o'clock. Like all that freedom. But like, so I don't regret it for a second. But I also I think that there's so many people that paint this like version of entrepreneurship that is. Very glossy. It's very glossy, where it's hard, right? Like if I was going back, the things that it's hard to say if you had have told me, I would have even heard it. And also, business was this hypothesis of here's a way that you can create value for people in a way that they're going to derive value for it. And then you find out that that hypothesis was 70% right, 30% wrong. And so you've got to keep this like continually adjusting towards how can we create the most value for people? And then how can you do it consistently and profitably? And so the thing that I think of, like, because I have this conversation with myself, right? What would I have done differently? Is, the focus on behavioral marketing, on neuromarketing, or we're doing a lot of employment brand work as well. Like that's been over the last 12 to 18 months of 6 years. So we've tested a lot of different things. We tested being partners for major marketing automation softwares. We tested, focusing a lot on funnels as a strategy or an approach. We've sort of evolved as the needs of our market, and where there's a little Venn diagram of what we're good at and what creates value and what people want to buy. But yeah, it's tricky. I don't think you know what the business is going to be until you're in motion. So you can have a great hypothesis, but like most hypothesis is often wrong. So then you've got to start testing and refining and testing different iterations until you find that sweet spot. And then when you do, then it's a different challenge, right? So I think I was, with all humility, maybe I was good at sales and marketing, but that actually shouldn't be my job in this business anymore, right? I should be about like consistency of outcome and delivery and process and people, and there's all of those other things. And so the skills, generally you'll have skills that get you to a certain level, and then it's all of that other stuff that you didn't have and you didn't realize that you were terrible at becomes all of it puts the brakes on until you learn to master those things somehow.
And also I think just learning on the fly as well, as you say, you kind of find yourself in it and you go, oh, actually all these things I didn't know that I had to do, I now have to do. I better work out how to do them.
Yeah, and for your personal growth as well. Like we're big fans of this book called Extreme Ownership, but essentially like it is always my fault, right? No matter what it is, and no matter even who did it, like it's always my fault. Right, because I didn't communicate something well, I didn't put something in place for them, I said yes to the wrong thing, I said yes to the right thing, but then didn't give the other people the things to do it. So yeah, you have to like the thick-skinnedness of it's always your fault, everything is your fault because you made it, and you like one way or another you're responsible for all of those bits being exactly where they are, which is why it's your fault. And if it goes well, then it was definitely had nothing to do with you, which is also true, right? So yeah, so the experience of entrepreneurship is you develop a lot as a person. You've got to be humble because all of the successes from the people around you, and it has to be because otherwise you don't have a business, you got a job.
Mm,
But then simultaneously, all of the wins are your teams and all of the mistakes are yours because that's the only way you can progress.
yeah. That it probably encroaches slightly, but also sort of leads on to my my final question, which is always the final question here on the podcast, which is what do you know now that you wish you knew then?
What do I know now that I wish I knew then? Um, I have a different appreciation for systems and process, and their ability to create consistency and scale. So, if I talked about back then, there was this like, there's a sense of creativity and
Mm,
an ability to synthesize information. So I could come up with good marketing campaigns. But that doesn't mean that you can have a team of 20 that come up with good marketing. It's an
yeah.
entirely different thing. So it probably relates to what I was talking about then. But yeah, the thing that I wish I knew is that like you need to understand, you need clarity, not just on your strengths, but where all of your personal handbrakes are, and you'll have lots of them.
Mm,
And you just need to accept them and be okay with it as well, right? You can't like, it won't help anyone sort of staying at home crying because I'm bad at process. Right? It's like, okay. And so then you need to alleviate it, you need to hire for it. So you've got to navigate that somehow. But yeah, being really aware of it makes a big difference. I don't feel like that was a good answer. That's my
no,
answer.
it was a really interesting answer. I really like it, and I think it's
Yeah.
that that scale part of it's really interesting as well, because as you say, you might be good at that thing that was the initial spark for the business, but if
Yeah.
you can't replicate that because you can't kind of replicate
Yeah.
yourself,
Yeah.
then you've got a different challenge, haven't you?
Yeah. And nor should you replicate yourself as well, right? Because then you've got this
Yeah.
weird lopsided business that can only do one thing. Yeah. So you've got to understand all of those blind spots and
Hmm.
just manage them. Hire people that are much better than it than you are. Trust them on it. Yeah.
Nice. Well, thank you. Thanks for taking us through the neuro marketing journey. Super
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, really, really interesting. I will pop some contact details in the bio or wherever you're listening, watching this to for those that wish to get in contact with Sean. But thank you very much for taking the time.
Thanks
Appreciate
so
it.
much for having me on, Emma. I really appreciate it. It's great to spend the time with you today.
Very welcome. Thank you.